Next, from the state capitol, Republican Representative Mike Fortner talks to us following the vote on the pension reform bill and explains why he voted against the bill and what changes he thinks should be a part of pension reform.
Mike Fortner, the House of Representatives just passed SB-1, the pension reform bill. What are your thoughts immediately coming off the floor after the vote?
Well, I had still some very serious concerns with the bill, and that is why I voted no. We've seen all pieces of this, and there are many good and needed pieces in this proposal, but there are some things that give me pause. I feel that based on what I've read from the transcript of our Constitutional Convention of 1969, what other states that have the same sort of language have experienced as they've tried to reform it, that the changes, particularly to the COLAs for those who have retired, I'm concerned that that is unconstitutional and won't hold up in court, at least in the form of this bill. I understand they've done a lot to try to get over that hump, and I think people can make their own decisions, and that's what we saw in the debate and with the votes today. I don't think we've reached that point myself. I also raised a question about the funding guarantee. There was some discussion. There was a bullet point that was made that there's now a funding guarantee. But based on the answers I received to that question, it's a funding guarantee which is really no stronger than what we have right now under our current law, which says that there's a continuing appropriation to make the pension payment. This guarantee does not bind future legislatures to change the number as they need to make the budget work. So that doesn't seem like much of a guarantee. And we've seen in the past that this is exactly what got us into trouble. That even once back in 1995, when we passed a law that was going to try to resolve this pension problem, we left it in the hands of the General Assemblies in the future, after 1995, to be willing to change that number, to not stay on track. And we are still faced, in the form of the language we were given today, with the same problem. We've done nothing to correct what I think was really the root of what got us into this mess.
And what do you think is the root that what got us into this?
Well, it's the fact that the legislature has had a hand to use the pension money, essentially deferring payments or sometimes even shorting the payment entirely in order to pay for other things, rather than address the budget as its own problem, without trying to say, well, we can use the pension as an extra fund that we can draw from, we can sweep from, as much as the legislature has done with other funds over the years.
The federal government has been doing exactly that with Social Security and the surplus that's been running up over the last 30 years, diverting that money into other purposes. Allegedly, there's a trust fund, but it's not funded. So, and the state, as you're saying, has been doing somewhat the same thing. Leader Cross used a statistic, said reducing our unfunded liabilities by $30 billion is not insignificant, he said on the floor. Is that the number that you've heard? And that's in the context of us having unfunded liabilities somewhat north of $100 billion. So do you accept the $30 billion number? And if you do, how much of a solution is this if it's only fixing a third of the problem?
Well, all the solutions out there, keep in mind that the number around 100 billion that's talked about, that is not our total liability. Our total liability is more like 160, 170 billion, because that includes money that we have assets for. The 100 billion is what are our liabilities for which the systems do not hold assets. That's why we call that the unfunded liability. And the problem is, by not having assets, there's no growth to the value of those assets. So that's why that part grows so rapidly. And we do need to address it. I've provided a number of solutions that I've proposed over the last couple of years that would address that, going even all the way back to providing bills before we voted on Tier 2. I had provided ideas for things, recognizing even back in 2009 that we really need to be on this and focusing on it. But I think we have to do it in a way that we really make sure we fix it, we don't have to come back. It is going to be even more painful if we find that the courts can't find this to be constitutional. We're just going to be 2 more years down the line with yet no solution. And I think there are ideas out there, there are pieces. I think if you ask, will they save us as much money right at the beginning? No, they won't. I think that's part of the problem.
They being the reforms.
Right. Reform, the more constitutional you try to make the reforms, I think it's fair to say the less they will save you at the beginning. Will they stabilize the system? You can take any of the reforms and probably build it into a package by which you can stabilize it and make those reforms. This is one example of how to do it. But a lot of it is, how much do you need to save? See, there's not a consensus, I think, on how much we need to save. Everyone says we need to save more, but it's a trade-off.
One of the reforms in SB-1 is, first of all, to have actuarial accounting, which one wonders why, if you're running a pension system, you wouldn't have done that from the very beginning. It's like building a house without putting windows in it. It just seems like it would have been a natural thing to do. But who comes up with the numbers that are being saved? Is this political math, or is someone who's an actuarial accountant coming in and conferring with you? Let's maybe take that one as a follow-up would be, in your caucuses meetings or consultations, has there been any legal expert come in and talk to you on the constitutionality of these reforms and to what extent they may or may not pass the muster?
Well, let me take, you've got 2 very different questions there. So let me first deal with the actuarial part. We actually right now have actuarially required computations to determine what the state payments are. That was set into law. It was reaffirmed in the 1995. That's what set the payment structure that we are currently facing year to year right now. The difference is that there's more than one way to do those actual computations. We use something called a projected unit credit, which basically tends to backload the cost. That is to say, as you get further along in your employment, the relative actuarial cost of the system gets bigger. There's another way of computing called entry age normal, which basically treats all your years of employment about the same. That is to say, there's more front loading. So it's probably a more accurate and fair. In fact, we passed earlier a bill in the House that made just that change. It's a well-directed change. It's a change we need to change to that, because it's a sounder way in terms of projecting long-term what our actual costs are. But we do have an actual one. It's just not the best mechanism that we could use.
And on the constitutionality?
On that question, I don't recall specifically that as a caucus we've met with an outside attorney, but certainly there have been attorneys on both sides and at any number of House committee meetings going back over a number of years that these pension bills have been before the House for debate.
I'm not sure. I think it might have been Elaine Neckrits, who is the chairman of the House Pension Committee, who was making the argument, people call it the police powers, that, in other words, that the state has a higher obligation to make sure that it is functional, if you want to just put it in layman's terms, and that you can't allow just one aspect, in this case pensions, to so become a growing problem that the state becomes dysfunctional. Is that an argument that you found compelling, and if not, why not?
It's certainly an argument that other states have made, and some with some degree of success. Others have been attacking the pension problem. What is different here in Illinois is that when our current Constitution was debated back in 1969, there was specifically the subject of what if the pension systems are insolvent? That question came up and was debated. And they made clear that the intent of the language was that insolvency did not relieve the state of the clear language of the state constitution, that they would not be able to make a diminishment of the retirees' benefits. So I think in some states that would be a more compelling argument. I think that is a less compelling argument, at least it is for me here in Illinois, based on what the framers of our current Constitution very clearly set out in their own debates.
And then lastly, if this becomes law, as we said, it doesn't, it only addresses approximately, what, a third of the unfunded liabilities, if the numbers we hear. So can you take another bite at the apple? Do we have another pension reform bill next year that tries to get us to where Speaker Madigan said in testimony before the House that it was set to get the system to 100% funded by 2044? I don't know if you think this will accomplish that, or is there going to be some other reform that's necessary?
Well, as far as getting us to 2044, I think this bill probably can do is, particularly if the future legislatures don't play around with the law of the payment, which unfortunately this still gives them that wiggle room. If they really stay on track, they can get there. What I think is the issue in terms of whether or not we can make the payment, the real problem that we've been facing these last few years, more than the dollar amount, is the fact that the pension payments have been growing at a rate which is roughly double our natural rate of revenue growth. The reason why this is such a problem is that every year, obviously the recession years accepted, there's going to be some natural growth in revenue. And when there's that natural growth, you would hope that the areas of the budget wouldn't be growing faster. Any area that grows faster than that natural growth of revenue is going to crowd out other areas. The dollar amounts can go up, but if the dollar amounts are going up more slowly than your revenue grows, then you're not going to see that crowd out problem. Our current ramp structure, the payments, the actuarially required payments we're making, are causing that crowd out right now because of the way the 1995 Act was structured.
And let me insert just for the viewers. I believe that the current fiscal year, because of the growth of the economy, although it's a slow growth, the state is taking in approximately $800 million more than it had in the previous year, but the pension payment went up by $1 billion. So the pension payment ate up all of the increase tax revenues, and there's $200 million more that then has to come out of other programs, is what you're saying.
Right. It's not unlike a person who's got a balloon payment on a mortgage. Maybe it looks really good the first few years, much as it did here in Illinois in the 1990s, but it is now growing at a rate more rapidly than the revenue, the income to the state can handle. We do need to fix it, and I think this bill probably does address it. I don't think it's the only way out there that could address it. I think there are more secure ways that we could have addressed it.
All right. Well, Representative Mike Fortner, we'll appreciate you taking the time, and thanks for sharing your thoughts.
The Illinois Channel's coverage of legislative issues is underwritten in part by AARP Illinois.